So welcome everyone, and I'll let Elise start her presentation. You can go ahead, Elise.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elise Visentin. I am a Master's of Education candidate. This is my first year at Queen's University, and I'm going to be presenting something today that's a work in progress. The title has changed many times, so the title that was in the abstract or the schedule has changed since. And so the title that I'm working with right now is Roads to Bad Places Are Paved with Good Intentions. And specifically, I'm looking at how race impacts responsive teaching practices. So just to go over what we are going to be doing today, or kind of what the presentation will be outlining, I'm going to be going over this step by step. So I'm going to kind of connect it to my own, my research to my own life experiences before I go through the research problem question, talk a little bit about the literature, and then go through the theoretical framework, methodology, how I plan to sample the participants, and then lastly, how I collect some data. So without further ado, I'm going to get started with a personal story. So I am originally from the GTA, and I had a very sterilized education growing up. And what I mean by that is that I didn't really have a lot of discussion about discrimination or racism in any of my classes. I didn't learn about residential schools till much later in university. And I really wanted to ensure that I was inclusive as a teacher and really try to like promote equity in my teaching. So I attended like multiple equity workshops. And the lesson on the left-hand side was something that I tweeted out on my professional Twitter, thinking that this was a lesson that really showcased how I was being equitable. And you can see that, you know, even just using terminology in that tweet, when I look back now, like 2 years later, I'm already questioning some things that I wrote, but it was retweeted by the school board. It was retweeted by like my school specifically. And I thought that this was a good lesson because I was looking at immigrants' experiences in Canada during that time period. And I had specifically gone out and got excerpts from different books to make sure that I was reflecting the students' cultures in my classes in what they were learning. So we weren't using a textbook. And I think that that could have been improved a lot. And so now when I look back, I obviously reflect and see kind of like where I could have gone differently. But a few months after this, so I was a teacher in the Peel District School Board. And a few months after this lesson, the Ontario Ministry of Education report came out. And if you guys, I'm not sure if any of you are aware of the report or not, but basically it outlined systemic racism that has been prevalent in Peel for like many years. And for me, I was really shocked and like caught off guard because I didn't realize that it was that bad. And this also raised the question of why I didn't realize that this was happening sooner. So there is so much literature out there about this, and I didn't know about any of it. And that just like speaks to the privilege that I have as a white teacher in Peel. And so this has brought me on like a journey of questioning, kind of like, where do we go from here? Are we looking for like equity? Are we looking for like justice? Are we looking for like addressing racism? And so where I am going right now with my research is to specifically look at how teachers' race is impacting the students. So the review that I had just mentioned revealed that systemic racism and inequity negatively impacts racialized students' academic success more than non-racialized students. And when I'm saying racialized students, this was outlined in the document, the ministry report, as students from African, Afro-Caribbean, African Canadian, Indigenous, and Latin American students. And so this often leads to reduced learning achievements, higher dropout rates, and this is manifested typically through implicit biases and also the lack of racial diversity. So you can see on the left-hand side, the majority of racial backgrounds with secondary students are South Asian, but you can see the majority on the right-hand side. The majority of teachers teaching in Peel specifically is white. And this is something that is prevalent all across Ontario. And so to kind of mitigate these impacts, teachers have to really analyze their racial identities biases and practices, but this often is met with a lot of backlash. And that has been demonstrated in the United States as well as Canada. So a lot of teachers in Canada, and I have witnessed this, have said like, I don't see color, like I'm colorblind. And that in itself, research has found that that in itself is synonymous with white privilege. And so for me, this is kind of where my research lies, and like, how do we move forward from here? So my research question is, how does the teacher's race impact their pedagogy? So how does that impact their curriculum, the resources that they're using, and teacher strategies in racially diverse intermediate classes? And I'll go into a little bit more why I'm so specific for intermediate later. So this is kind of what I'm looking at, and the research gap is coming from the fact that a lot of this research has been done in the GTA to say this is the problem that we have, but not a lot of research has been actually implemented by teachers. So what I'm hoping to do, and I'll go into more of this in my methodology, but I'm hoping to get other teachers who have taught in racially diverse classrooms, and as a collective and through collaborative action research, I want to try to see how we can work together with each other to deconstruct and analyze our practices. So the one way that I have found, or research has also demonstrated, is culturally responsive pedagogy is a method to mitigate these the inequity basically in education. So the inequity in education can be mitigated by CRP, which is culture responsive pedagogy. It increases inclusion, it increases engagement, and it also increases student success. And so the way that you need to do this is like, typically you need to intentionally like plan. And Lucas and Villegas, I feel like I always mispronounce those names, but they outline this framework, and they set it into 6 culturally responsive characteristics or mindsets, which are outlined there on the slide. And the one that I'm specifically looking at is the last one, sorry, which is responsive teaching practices. And I think that that's, obviously, I know this is only one part of a really long journey, but I think that in focusing first on that, I'm hoping to get the conversation started with some of my colleagues and then branching out from there. So the research that I'm proposing is to document this journey of looking at our responsive teaching practices and seeing how we can improve them to better reflect our students. And the timeline at the bottom there, you'll see that those are all reports that have stemmed from the GTA, so from the Toronto region or just outside of it, over the past 6 years, that have all demonstrated that the curriculum or teaching practices in general is really where we need to start. So all of those reports all advocate for teaching practices to change and be more reflective of our students. And so that could be in the planning, it could be like in auditing classroom resources, but I think that that is really somewhere where we need to start. And teachers obviously are someone who sometimes there are things that are out of our control, but there are things that we can control. And so that's kind of where my my work is starting. So the theoretical framework that I'm going to be working on, or working with, I should say, emerged in the 1990s in education by Tate and Ladsing-Billings. So it's critical race theory. And if you're not familiar with it, it's based on the notion that racial inequality and inequity are embedded in daily aspects of life. And there's usually 2 common interests which are noted there. So the first is to understand how white supremacy and subordinating people of color have created and maintained this white supremacy in society. And the second part is a desire to change, not merely just to understand this, but to push it a step further and to try to change it. And so with my research, CRT will be used as the framework that I'm outlining my work in. And the reason that I'm choosing this framework is because the inequity and racism in education can be seen blatantly, but also in like a lot of like subtle and hidden processes that have the effect of discrimination, regardless of their intent. And that's something that is typically synonymous with CRT. So the methodology that I had mentioned earlier is collaborative action research. And this is kind of something that I'm just working through right now. So this is what I'm trying to iron out. So it's conducted by a team of practitioners. So what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be working with teachers, and we're going to be trying to improve student learning, and improve our own practice, develop in our profession, and also to overcome like trying to do this alone, basically, because I think it's really important to do this with others. And so Sagar has outlined this process, and I've kind of visually depicted it on the right here of what I plan to do. So I'm hoping that we can identify the problem and envision success together as a team, and then develop a plan of action before we collect the data. And the plan of action is really going to be like, what kinds of resources are we, or lessons or strategies are we going to be talking about that we can deconstruct? And the collecting data part will be going over it and talking with one another, hopefully in some kind of like, whether it's Zoom or in person, I don't know yet, but we're going to be discussing exactly what we have put forward in our classroom before we start analyzing it. And then finishing off the reporting of the data, and then basically starting again. And I'm hoping that this can later actually be done where we implement the changes that we want to make in our classroom. So hopefully research down the line will open up that door as well. So who I'm going to be sampling for my participants, I'm hoping to do this through criterion sampling. Specifically, I'd like to have grade 7 and 8 teachers, mainly because that's my background. I taught in intermediate for 5 years in Peel, and that's something that I think that it's important that we share that, that experience, and the curriculum is also similar at that age as well. So I think that it's good because that's going to provide like a more authentic and rich discussion, because we'll all have experience with the same age group. I'm also planning on recruiting people that are, teachers that teach in a classroom where they are not the same race as the majority of the students, because I think that that's a lot of the time where like the whiteness in teaching comes through, even though we may not intend it to be the case. And I'm also wanting to mention that I want to recruit over social media. So whether that's like Twitter, Facebook, and hopefully I'll do this with 5 to 10 participants. So that's my participants. And I just want to quickly go over my data collection. So like I had mentioned earlier, we're going to develop the plan. I'd like to meet with them and share what the plan is going to be. Maybe we talk together and collaborate at that time. And then as we collect the data, I want to share, like I said, lessons, artifacts, experiences that we think were equitable, and then discuss how maybe those actually weren't equitable to our students. And those sessions hopefully will be recorded and transcribed. And then lastly, the data will be inductively analyzed through CRT. And I'm hoping to use in vivo for the data analysis aspect, which I still need to be trained on. And I believe that's it. If anyone has any questions, I don't know if there's any time or if we are able to do that, but I have my email there at the bottom if anyone wants to reach out. I'm very much open to feedback. I'm still at the beginning stages of this. I haven't written my proposal or for my colloquium yet, so I definitely would appreciate any feedback.
Thank you so much, Elise. Actually, we do have quite some time before we jump up to the next session. So we have around like 7 minutes. So if anyone have questions for Elise, please go ahead and jump in. You can open your camera if you want to now.
Can I go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Elise. I think it's very interesting. I'm the next speaker, and I'm also going to be talking a little bit about responsive teaching, but definitely right now not with your idea of the culturally inclined responsive teaching. So I'm just curious to know, when you said that you're going to hire your participants, are they going to be teachers and students? I'm not sure if I missed it, but I'm curious to know, how are you going to identify who, like, how are you going to identify your participants?
Maybe I didn't actually say that. I'm only planning on working with teachers. I think that originally I wanted to work with students as well, because it's hard when you're coming at this work to say like, this is equitable from a teacher perspective, or this is not equitable from a teacher perspective. But with the time constraints of my program, I believe I'm only going to end up working with teachers. So I don't know if that answers the question of how I'm going to identify them. Did I answer it?
So are you going to go to school? You already know people?
Yeah, so I worked in Peel for 5 years, and I've established a lot of relationships there. So I'm hoping to recruit over social media, so Twitter or Facebook, with people in like public forums, and hopefully there will be enough interest there that people will be willing to participate, and that's where I'll be grabbing my participants from.
Right, and how will you know that they've had the experience to work with kids with different ethnic background? Yeah, because that's your case, right? You want to identify teachers and discuss with people.
I would, I haven't gone through ethics yet or done any of this formally, but that's something good to consider. I think when I put that recruitment out on social media, there will be some type of like a poster or something attached that says like, this is the criteria that I'm looking for, whether you're like a grade 7-8 teacher, and then also teaching students from a different race. Originally, I was contemplating not having that as a criteria. So that's something that I still need to consider.
Right, and considering that probably most of the schools, I'm not sure how it is in Toronto, but I'm assuming that most of the schools probably will have kids from different races. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Peel is one of the more culturally and like racially diverse boards in Ontario. So that typically is the case, that a lot of teachers are not the same race as their students. But that's interesting too, because then after I need to decide like how much is the majority, and like I need to iron that out.
Right. Good luck with that.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a question for Elise as well. So actually on the schedule, it says it's about in Ontario that you'll be conducting or finding your participants. Are you still planning to do it in Ontario, or are you planning out to also, let's say, find participants in other provinces in Canada?
I think that that's a great ambition to have, possibly if this continues on into like a PhD. Because I'm only looking for 5 to 10 participants, I would like to keep it to Ontario, and specifically to the GTA too, because when you move out of the GTA, the ethnic makeup and like cultural makeup of the schools change drastically. I'm sure that if I went to like Montreal, for example, like I may find a similar demographic, but I just don't know the curriculum enough there to be able to like confidently speak to it. So for right now, I'm just keeping it to Ontario, and specifically the Greater Toronto area.
Perfect, thank you. So we still have 2 minutes left. So if anyone wants to jump in to ask questions, but if you are done with your question, you can either stay here for Vandana's next presentation, or you can move around to go to the next, to the other rooms as well to participate. So I'll leave that open.
Oh, she has a question, Amanda, sorry.
Thanks. So yeah, I was just curious as to whether you're thinking about, in terms of like critical race theory and teaching, are you looking at examples of teaching about race, or just teaching that acknowledges race, like about other subjects?
So aside from culturally responsive teaching, I've also considered doing this research around anti-racist education. And so with that, you would specifically be addressing racism, and not only just acknowledging it, but also like pushing back against it. So that's something that I need to explore in my research as well, because I have contemplated culturally responsive pedagogy and anti-racist education against each other to see which one would be not valid, but which one would have more impact. So I don't know if that answers the question. Sorry, I still am in the work in progress. So these questions are definitely going to help inform what I'm doing next. And and I have to rewatch them because I'm sure I didn't even answer the question, Amanda, but hopefully
No, I was just wondering, like, what are you thinking about that kind of thing in general? I wasn't looking for a particular answer, so you totally answered it.
Okay, no problem.
Perfect. Then I think that's it for Elise for her presentation session. So thank you, Elise. And I'll just invite Vandana to get ready for her presentation. And if you guys want to stay in this room, please stay for Vandana, and or else you can also go around in the other rooms.
Okay, so what should I do now? Should I? Okay, so I can start sharing my introduction screen now. Okay.
Absolutely, you can start right now. Like, you can get ready. You have 5 minutes to get ready. So
okay, sounds good.
Perfect.
Vandana, I'm after you presenting in the same room, so but I want to see your presentation, but I'm going to turn off my camera because I'm going to like walk around and get some energy out before I do it. But I'm really curious about yours.
Right. Thanks for staying.
It was really convenient actually that all the ones I had highlighted were in the same stream.
Oh yeah, really. I wasn't expecting Elise talk. I didn't see the talk, like the title, but it was nice that it was similar theme.
So I don't think we are themed at all. I had the impression that just coincidentally ones that matched other interests of mine that are not what I'm researching like happened to be in the same room. But right. I mean, it's cool. It's nice that it worked out.
And I was wondering for Amanda, if you're still around.
Yes.
Okay. Do you know if are you gonna stay in this room after to help out, or is there gonna be any?
Oh no, so I mean, officially I volunteered in the morning, and then I like checked out of volunteering after the poster presentation, so I was planning to watch stuff.
Okay, perfect, because I was like, oh, I'm alone, so I don't actually have the other two supporters, but it's fine so far. It's so good. It's just like sometimes my internet speed, I don't know why, like everything goes well, like I close down everything else. There's only one computer, but sometimes it's a little tiny bit laggy. So that's why I was like, oh, if someone could record, that would be great. But that's fine. I think so far so good. So
yeah, and sometimes it has to do with like your neighbors even probably like on the same network, or not the same network, but like just using the same infrastructure. Who even knows?
Yeah, I think it's also like, well, when everyone closes their camera, it works better. But so far it's a lot better than this morning. This morning was kind of hectic. So
yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna unmute myself because I'm getting lost when I'm sharing the screen. So I'm gonna unmute and then share my screen. Okay.
No problem. Go ahead.
Yeah. QR screen. Okay, you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Let me know when you're ready. I'll start.
Perfect. I'll let you know.
So I'm just, if you want, I can go track down Tiffany and ask if she can track down the other people that are supposed to be volunteering with you. Who
actually, I think it's fine because she is gonna present right after this one.
Oh,
so
yeah, that's huge.
So I don't want to pressure her. So
we couldn't watch each other. But like, I know Carla. I don't know why she's not here.
Yeah, well, so far so good. So I think it's gonna be fine. But if it ever glitches on the YouTube channel, I'm so sorry, guys. It's I apologize for my internet speed.
No, I'm glad it's not me. For me, my internet is usually good, but I don't have space on my computer to store a big video file. So
yeah, that's no problem. Yeah. So in 1 minute we'll be starting.
And 20 minutes talk? No. 15.
It's 15 minutes and then 5 minutes of question. So if I jump into with like 5 minutes or 2 minutes,
okay,
don't feel offended by me.
Yeah, but just let me know, maybe like 2 minutes. Yeah,
perfect. I'll let you know at 5 minutes and 2 minutes.
Okay.
I just realized I have to chase down Tiffany because I'm not a co-host anymore and I'm gonna have to screen share. So I'm gonna go run around, but I'll come back in the room.
Perfect. All right. And at the same time, we can start with Vandana. Please go ahead.
All right. Hi, my name is Vandana, and I'll be sharing my work in examining how Novice teachers' attention was drawn to teacher moves, particularly responsive moves, which supports students' engagement. And in particular, I'm going to compare across math and science. All right. So recent reforms in math and science suggest that for students to become effective learners of math and science, teachers should build on students' prior knowledge. And one way teachers can engage with students' thinking is by adopting responsive teaching practices. Such teaching practices are adaptive and responsive to students' thinking. A critical aspect of learning responsive teaching practices entails noticing how these practices are enacted. Noticing is often described as what we see and hear. And as individuals, we do not see and hear everything around us. We notice certain things over others. Though there has been research work on how to support teachers to notice responsive teaching, it is limited in the context of teachers viewing sample lessons or limited to one discipline. Less is known about how teachers are supported to notice responsive teaching while teaching. In my study, I'm going to focus on supports of teacher noticing of responsive teaching practices while they're teaching and across the disciplines of math and science. So this leads to my research questions. I have 3 of them. The first one is, in what ways do teacher educators and novice teachers draw attention to the practice of responsive teaching when NTs practice teaching? Second, do NTs use these moments when noticing, and if so, how? And my last one is, how do these moments differ across math and science? I particularly focus on 2 responsive teaching practices, responsive teaching practices, eliciting students' thinking and responding to students' thinking. So what do we mean by eliciting and responding to students' thinking? These are teacher moves which can help in engaging with students' ideas. Such moves includes posing questions to know students' initial thinking. For example, when a teacher wants to know the strategy used by a student for solving a problem, she can ask, how did you solve the problem? Or probing on students' ideas to elaborate their explanation. A teacher can probe on a student's strategy in math by asking, can you explain why the strategy works? Or engaging students to explain other students' ideas. For example, after listening to a student's strategy, a teacher can ask, can someone explain the strategy in your own words? For this research, I draw upon situative perspective, which emphasizes that learning and cognition occur through interaction, and hence is distributed across people and materials. In addition, the context plays a key role in shaping the way people think and learn. Aligned with situative approach, I conceptualize noticing through a sociopolitical lens to understand what teachers notice in the context. This lens to noticing considers the social, cultural, and political influence in their noticing. And I operationalize noticing using 2 constructs. The first is attending. This describes what teachers observe. The second is reasoning. This describes how they make sense of what they have observed. Drawing from the literature on teacher supports and Goodwin's seminal framework on professional vision, teachers are supported to notice in a number of ways. One kind of support is the facilitation practice. The facilitators mediate the interaction between teachers and the tools by using discourse moves, which includes physical action like pointing to make aspects of practice visible and obvious to novices. Second kind of support for noticing is the use of artifacts such as video recorded lesson or students' work. Such artifacts allows teachers to observe and analyze them deliberately with the purpose to improve the practice. And third is the use of frameworks. Frameworks are a list of coding schemes or codes constructed by the members of the community to discipline the perception of new members to see salient aspects in an event which are important for that profession. For example, frameworks from noticing studies decompose the practice of teaching into categories, which the teachers are supported to pay attention to when they view forms of classroom artifacts. Such codes inform teachers what they should be noticing in the artifact or provide vocabulary of what they had noticed. Now, this research was done in an elementary math and science methods course in public university in Canada. I recruited 7 novice teachers who, as a part of each course, participated in a rehearsal of teaching. A rehearsal is a simulated teaching setup that allows the novice teachers to practice teaching. And apart from that, I recruited 4 teacher educators at Math and Science Methods course, 2 from each, 2 of them being instructors, 1 from math, 1 from science, and 2 teaching assistants who facilitated the rehearsals, 1 in math and 1 in science. During rehearsals, novice teachers enacted each instructional activity in a group of 2 or 3, as you see here. They each teach about 7 to 10 minutes to teach their part of instructional activity. For rehearsals, if you see on the right, while one of the novice teacher is rehearsing, other novice teachers acted as students. The teacher educator sat in the corner, as you see here, and either the rehearsing entity or the teacher educator were able to pause the teaching to ask questions or to make suggestions about the teaching. The rehearsal was video recorded for the rehearsing entity to view and reflect on their practice as part of a class assignment. Now, rehearsals provided multiple opportunities for novice teachers to develop their responsive teaching practice with immediate feedback for improvement given by the TE during the interactions between the novice teachers and the TE. They thus served a rich context by investigating how NT's attention was drawn to the practice of ENR and to understand what NTs drew from these interactions. During the rehearsals, the class was split into 2. So that 2 rehearsals happened simultaneously in 2 different rooms. One was facilitated by the teacher educator and the other was facilitated by the TA. So for this study, I collected 4 kinds of data. First, I collected pre-rehearsal interview to get some background information about my participants. Second, I collected field notes and video recordings of lessons, which prepared novice teachers for their math and science rehearsals. This provided an insight into how novice teachers engaged in the preparation of responsive teaching for the rehearsals. Third, I video recorded the math and science rehearsals to know how novice teachers engaged in eliciting and responding moves. And last, I conducted a post-rehearsal interview to explore what novice teachers noticed about eliciting and responding move in their own teaching in math and science. In this interview, novice teacher watched the rehearsal video and discussed what they noticed about ENR practice in their teaching. For the purpose of the study, I looked at the audio of pre-rehearsal interview, the rehearsals, and their post-rehearsal interview. For this presentation, I focus on one of my participants. I'll call her Isabel. Isabel had a traditional teacher-centered learning experience, particularly as a learner of math and science. As a learner, she seemed to be comfortable with both math and science. I focused on Isabel because her experience was representative of the majority of my participants. My analysis consists of 3 phases. In phase 1, I analyzed the ways in which TE and NTs drew attention to the practice of ENR in Isabel's rehearsal. Second, in phase 2, I analyzed how Isabel drew upon NT and TE interaction while viewing her rehearsals. And in phase 3, I analyzed how these moments differed across math and science. I will go over each of these in more detail. Like I mentioned earlier, in phase 1, to see how the interaction between the TE and the NT drew Isabel's attention to the practice of ENR, I analyzed her math and science rehearsal videos. I developed 2 kinds of episodes for each rehearsal, NT teaching episode and TE NT episodes. NT teaching episodes captured Isabel's teaching. TE NT episodes captured moments when the rehearsal was paused and conversations happened between teacher educator and novice teachers. Next, I identified TE NT episodes where the interaction was about the ENR practice. To do so, in the TE NT episodes, I looked for suggestions or queries related to ENR practice. Then I transcribed these TE NT episodes. Finally, drawing upon the literature of supports, I characterized how NT and TE drew attention to the practice of ENR. For phase 2, I looked into Isabel's post-rehearsal interview to see if she drew upon the TE and TE interactions in her rehearsal. To do so, I identified moments when Isabel attended to ER practice in her rehearsal video I then transcribed those moments and drawing upon the socio-political framework, I characterized what she attended to and how she reasoned about what she attended to. Then I compared the analysis of Isabel's noticing from the interview and my analysis of the TENT interactions to see if she used any similar language or drew upon suggestions provided during the rehearsal to make sense of what she noticed. This analysis was done for both math and science. For phase 3, I took my analysis from phase 2 for math and science, and then I compared them across. My results. So in my results, I found that across math and science, there were 3 types of interactional moves used to bring NT's attention to the practice of ENR. One way was highlighting aspects in an artifact. The TE highlighted aspects by using verbal stress or pointing to parts of an artifact. Example of artifacts used in the rehearsal context were charts which consisted of instructional goals for each lesson and video recordings of the rehearsal. For example, in one of the interactions in math rehearsal, when suggesting a probing question to target one of the instructional goals of the lesson, TE highlighted the goal by pointing to the goal on the chart, used verbal stress to indicate that particular goal, and moved his finger along the goal on the chart while reading it aloud. In doing so, he was drawing her attention not just to the ER move, but also to the purpose of the move. The second interactional move used was providing a representation of practice. A representation of practice provides a model of an aspect of teaching practice for novice teachers. In this case, this involves suggesting an ER move. So for example, in Isabel's math rehearsal, TE suggested an ENR move to respond to students' thinking by saying, so you could have asked her, how did you know that it was from 6 to 12 and then from 12 to? So here by suggesting a question, TE showed Isabel what an ENR move or response could look like. The last interaction move used was providing a code. Codes are categories which inform teachers how to describe what they are observing in an event. For example, in science, TE suggested to Isabel that she needs to respond to students' ideas without any judgment. Here, the TE uses the code judgment to label or to describe her responding move. Moving on to research question 2 and 3. I now present how these interactions which occurred in the rehearsals differed across math and science, and whether Isabel drew upon these interactions from rehearsal when noticing her rehearsal videos. So across math and science, similar interactional moves of highlighting aspects in an artifact was used to bring Isabel's attention to ENR practice. Apart from that, in math, apart from, what did you say, sorry?
Sorry, 2 minutes left.
Okay. Apart from that, in math rehearsal, TE suggested a representation of an ENR practice, and in science rehearsal, TE provided a code to bring Isabel's attention to ENR. Isabel particularly seemed to draw upon these interactional moves when she observed her science rehearsal. However, it wasn't the same with respect to the math. Now I'm going to give you an example of what happened and how she drew upon it in her science rehearsal, from her science rehearsal. So to understand this, let's look at the interaction between Isabel and TE in her rehearsal. When Isabel was responding to students' ideas, TE paused Isabel and said, at this point, the idea is to take all of their ideas without any judgment. The TE suggested to Isabel that she needs to respond to students' ideas without any judgment. Here, the TE uses a code judgment to label or to describe her responding move. Let's look at how Isabel drew upon this code judgment when noticing in her rehearsal video. In the rehearsal video, Isabel noticed the way she said, okay, when responding to students' ideas. And she drew upon the judgment code to make sense that the tone of okay was bad and could be interpreted as she's judging that idea given by her student. And also she mentioned that it could mean that she's not agreeing to that idea. Later in the rehearsal, the TE highlighted aspects of an artifact, here the artifact being the video recording of the rehearsal. The TE highlighted that Isabel needs to watch for her face in the video recording of the rehearsal by saying, watch the video because your face all over. In the interview, while watching her rehearsal video, Isabel drew upon these interactions and seemed to focus on her face when observing her teaching to make sense of how she responded to students' thinking. As you see here, she focuses on her face. She says, look at my face, but my face is like, no. In this preliminary analysis, I see my work expanding the literature on facilitation practice.
I'm sorry, Vandana, but the time is up.
Okay.
So if you could maybe like in a minute, just like wrap it up.
Yeah, sure. So this work, I think this work contributes to some of the facilitation's moves, which will help the novice teachers to notice these practices, which are critical for them to learn, so that they enact these practices once they go into schools to start teaching. I think I'll stop here. Perfect.
Thank you so much. And right now, I will open the discussion or question session. So if you guys have any questions, you guys can turn up your video and ask Vandana about her research. So I'll let you guys go ahead.
Yeah, Vandana, thanks so much for your presentation. I can't turn off my video though, but
that's okay.
Sorry about that.
I'm happy to hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I'm just wondering, I was just flipping between taking care of my son and then listening to you. So you might have said what I'm going to ask, but I just want to like maybe clarify it in terms of, I'm really interested in like the methods, like data and all those kind of things. So I'm just wondering, like how many like in terms of the research participants, how many are they? And in terms of your analysis, I know you mentioned like you went through like in terms of the details, like how you went, but if you can give me like a summary of it or something, that would help, because maybe I wasn't at that time, I wasn't around or something. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So I had 7 participants, 7 novice teachers as my participants, who are doing their rehearsals in math as well as in science. And I had my TE, the instructors, who are facilitating those rehearsals as my participants. And with respect to my analysis, I can talk about maybe how I looked into the rehearsals to know what they were attending to. So I split the rehearsal video. So if you look at the screen, I have my rehearsal video. I split them into 2 kinds. So the parts where they were teaching and the parts where there was interaction happening. And I was focusing on the places where the interaction was happening, because in rehearsal, the teacher can pause, the novice teacher can pause and say, oh, I don't know what to do. Is this okay if I do this? Or the TE can pause the rehearsal suggesting moves. So I was more curious about what was happening in the interaction to help the novice teachers support to notice ENR practice. So I focused more on this to see how the interaction was supporting them to notice.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope I answered. Anyways.
So there's 2 minutes left to the session. I think we have only time for maybe one last quick question. If not, then thank you very much, Vandana, for this wonderful presentation. And we'll start with Amanda at with Amanda at 2 o'clock. Sorry. Yes, Elise.
Oh, you're Vandana, thank you so much for sharing. I'm just wondering, I don't know if I've never in Teachers College seen this type of like pausing and responding. So, and also this, like what you have pictured here in Teachers College in Ontario, I don't know any, maybe I'm not aware of them, but I don't know anyone that actually does it this way. So it would be interesting to know if this is done specifically at that university that you conducted the study at, or if this is practiced in the province there.
Oh, that's a very interesting question, because I am not sure whether it's practiced in, because I know this is done in other places in USA, but I particularly know that it is done in the university I collected my data from, but I am not aware about the other provinces, because I'm also not from Canada. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, thank you. I just thought it was a really interesting way to engage the novice teachers. Like, I think this is great. So I was interested in if that was like a university specific thing, but that's good.
Right. And I also, if I'm not wrong, I think universities in different provinces in Canada have different programs for teacher education. Like the province, the place I collected my data, the program was for 4 years. So it was one of the course where they're focusing on pedagogy, where this was part of it. So I think it just depends also in the program, I think.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Vandana, for your wonderful presentation. And yeah, I invite you guys to stay for Amanda's presentation after. But if you guys want to wander around in the other rooms, please feel free to. Perfect. Thank you. And I'll ask Vandana to stop sharing your screen, and then I'll ask Amanda to do it now.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry, Vandana, I just have one quick question.
Sure.
I'm just wondering, is it part of a bigger study, or is it part of your PhD studies?
Yes, this is part of my PhD studies. Yes.
Also, what's your PhD about? What are you focusing on? If you can let me.
Yes, so I'm focusing on novice teachers, and I'm focusing more on what do novice teachers learn about these specific practices which are taught in their university programs, that is responsive teaching practices. Especially I'm looking at eliciting and responding. I'm looking at what is being taught in the class and what do they actually pick from it. So I'm using this noticing framework and situative perspective framework to see, particularly in this context, this was what was taught to them. And then I'm just looking at what do they actually, how do they make sense of what is taught to them, or about these practices, which is a big focus in their course.
So which setting, what's the setting you're looking at? Where are you collecting your data? Like,
I didn't get your question. Sorry, can you ask me?
Last quickly. I'm just sorry I'm taking all of your time, but I'm just wondering, like, what's the setting? Like, where did you collect it? Where are you intending? Have you collected the data already, or you are yet to collect it in terms of for your PhD?
No, I collected my data. This is from one of my participants. Yeah.
So which area did you, like, where what was this?
Yes, I collected from Montreal.
Oh, okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Perfect. So Amanda, you can unmute and turn up, open your camera and start.
So I have to ask, have you been noticing when the little notifications pop up that somebody has entered the waiting room? Is that popping up in my screen share?
It's popping up on mine too, on my
Okay,
side as well, but I'm recording, so it's fine. Just let it.
Okay.
It
gonna hope it's
show
not.
from your screen, but it shows from my screen.
Okay, well, if it does, I apologize. So thank you. My name's, yeah, sorry.
No problem.
Oh, we've got still got 2 minutes, it's true. Okay, cool. I will wait. Yeah, I was super excited about this like share part of screen function, and I've been telling everybody about it. And I tested it out with my partner's computer to like see how it looked. There were no pop-ups happening though, so like I have no idea what happens in that case.
No worries. And for TNE, so the presentation is 15 minutes, and then there's 5 minutes of questions.
Okay, 15 minutes.
Yeah, 15 minutes and 5 minutes of question.
Noted. 5 minutes for the questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect. So Amanda, you can go ahead, and please everyone close your camera so we can have a very smooth recording of Amanda's session. And please go ahead, Amanda.
Thanks. So my name is Amanda Light Dunbar, and I'm a master's student at Concordia, and I'll be defending my thesis proposal next week. So today I'm going to describe my study and offer a very abridged literature review to put my research questions into some context. I'll start with a tiny bit of audience participation. So I might ask people to turn on their cameras, or you can use the raise hand function. Then I'll tell you about the context that my study came out of, which is the non-academic writing about SparkNotes. And then I'll get into my theoretical framework, which is grounded in new literacy studies and helps connect SparkNotes to broader issues in literacy. Before I get into talking about the research, though, I want to do the quick survey. So please raise your hand or click the raise hand icon if you graduated from high school in the year 2000 or later. We're going to see how this works. Okay. I feel like people are looking for it. It's in the reactions menu. We've got 5. Well, that's enough to start with. And me too, I'm in this group. So now keep your hand raised if you had heard of SparkNotes before today. Okay, so a bunch. Okay, people are figuring it out. We've got like a good more, we've got about 15. That's terrific. Okay, now, oops. Oh, I skipped ahead too much. If you'd heard of SparkNotes before today. So now keep your hand raised if you have ever used SparkNotes. So lower your hand if you haven't. Okay, so we had about 14 people raise their hands that they had heard of it, and about half of those people, a little more, still have their hand raised that they have used it. So that's what I'm hoping to find. That's perfect. So everyone can lower their hands. For the people who haven't heard of SparkNotes, or who might have heard about it, but you don't know the details, it's a website for literature study guides. So it's like Cole's Notes or Cliff's Notes. It's not the only study guide website, but it's an extremely popular one with over 500,000 visits per month on average. So next I'll tell you about my research plans. For my thesis project, the main thing I want to know is how many or what proportion of students use SparkNotes for support with high school English class. That's the primary research question. Then I want to know who SparkNotes users are. For example, if English is not your strongest language for reading, are you more likely to use SparkNotes than somebody who prefers to read in English? Are people who use SparkNotes more likely to be A students or C students? I also want to find out some details about how students use it. For example, do they read SparkNotes summaries instead of reading books, or do they use the study guides to help them understand the story as they're reading? Finally, I'm curious about students' attitudes towards their SparkNotes use, specifically whether or not they think of it as a type of cheating. I'm planning to gather this information through a short survey aimed at anybody who attended high school after the year 2000, including current students, plus high school English language arts teachers. That said, this is an exploratory study and there are no limits on participation. I don't have specific hypotheses about the correlations between things like grades and SparkNotes use. I really think it could go either way, but I do think that the majority of people in my target demographic will have used SparkNotes, which is what we saw today in the brief audience survey. So I think that bodes well. I'll give you the context for the hypothesis in the next section. At about this time last year, when I first began thinking seriously about SparkNotes, I started bringing it up in conversation, and it seemed like everyone had a story to tell. People's eyes would light up and they'd get these mischievous smiles on their faces, and the conversation would turn into some kind of confessional where everyone talked about how SparkNotes had absolutely saved them in high school. It seemed like something people were excited to talk about, and it seemed very widespread, but I couldn't find any research on it at all. That said, there's a lot of writing about SparkNotes in non-academic contexts, by which I mean things like education blogs, editorials and teaching magazines, student journalism, and books written by and for teachers. This writing is really the basis for my hypothesis and research questions. This is an example of the writing I'm talking about. This quote is from an American multi-college newspaper called Campus News from a student op-ed. I'll read what it says. Since attending college, I have made some stunning realizations. The one that bothers me the most is the hard truth that few students actually bother reading their assigned texts. When their professors are not standing over them, they brag about using a terrible website called SparkNotes to cheat on their homework. This op-ed was posted on the Campus News website where readers can select an emoji to convey their reaction to the text. And as you can see, of the 17 reactions, 59% or 10 people were angry, 29% or 5 people were happy, and 1 each were indifferent or amused. So this isn't a scientific poll, obviously, but it does illustrate the variation in popular opinions about SparkNotes. Among these opinions, I noticed 3 clear themes. The first is that students don't read books anymore. The second is that SparkNotes is a legitimate support. And the third is that SparkNotes is a cheating aid, as in the example I just shared. Each of these themes was supported by examples from both students and teachers writing, as well as my own experiences and the experiences I'd heard about from friends. Here are some examples representing the first theme, that students don't read books anymore. These are all from veteran teachers. Students won't read at home when there is another option. Students don't need to read real books at all anymore. They just need to make sure it seems as if they have. Students do anything but actually read the work itself. This one I find particularly interesting because at the time of the writing, this author was a teacher educator at multiple universities. And in his essay, he writes, students enter our secondary and post-secondary literature classes intending to not read the books we assign. They have been telling me this and demonstrating it to me for 12 years. Many students have admitted to me and to their classmates that in high school, they did not read any of the assigned books. In the same essay, he goes on to say that each semester he assigns To Kill a Mockingbird to his senior class. The students in this class are mostly English majors who are training to become high school English teachers. Each semester, he asks the students to raise their hands if they studied To Kill a Mockingbird in high school, and most of the hands go up. Then he asks how many of them actually read the book cover to cover, and most of the hands stay down. This is a part of the reason that I don't have hypotheses about the correlations between demographics and SparkNotes use. If anything, I've heard more about good students using it than poor ones. This is why I'm so eager to see what the data has to say. Many people see SparkNotes as a legitimate study aid, which is the second theme. Here are a couple of representative examples. The first is from a student quoted in a high school newspaper, and it reads, "If teachers won't always be there to answer my questions, SparkNotes helps to further my learning." The second is from a teacher who uses SparkNotes contemporary English versions of Shakespeare's plays, which are marketed as No Fear Shakespeare. He wrote, "Instead of spending time wrestling with translating the Shakespearean text, I'd rather my students spend time wrestling with the big ideas found in the text." This same teacher noted that he himself had used SparkNotes to review a play that he was going to see live and that it enriched his experience. This data is from an informal student survey. Levin was a high school senior, so 17, 18 years old, in 2011 when she wrote an article about SparkNotes for her local newspaper. She polled 63 peers who were taking grade 12 advanced placement English and found that the vast majority of them, 78%, had used SparkNotes in some form. Of these, the majority had used it in addition to reading the book. You can see from the chart that 60% of the students use SparkNotes as a support rather than a replacement for the assigned reading. The third theme is SparkNotes as a cheating aid, and you'll remember this slide from a moment ago. Since attending college, I've made some stunning realizations in this follow-up. However, almost all the books, articles, and posts that portray SparkNotes as a cheating aid admit to a level of nuance. For example, most distinguish between using SparkNotes instead of reading and using it to support reading. Many of the articles written by students feature quotes from teachers who admit to using it themselves to review details of books they've previously read. So the three themes, not reading, legitimate support, and cheating aid, are ultimately intertwined. Beyond the concrete details of what students are doing and thinking, SparkNotes relates to broader issues in literacy education. New literacy studies is a school of thought that helps identify and explain those issues. So that's what I'll talk about next. New literacy studies arose around the same time as SparkNotes, although I'm not suggesting a relationship. It's just a convenient way to remember the information. NLS is connected to cultural studies and curriculum studies in that it's very interested in ideology and the way that education can transmit and reinforce cultural values. It also views literacy as a set of social practices that depends on context rather than a set of specific skills. In new literacy studies, practices refers to things people do to understand a text and the things the text does to help people understand it. So a reader might think about a time when they had a similar experience to a character or make predictions about what will happen in the story. The text itself might allude to other related text, or it might use a familiar structure like a detective or a romance novel that follows a formulaic plot. Another way to think about new literacy studies is that it uses the word literacy in the same way as financial literacy. It's more about knowing how to behave in a particular context than it is about reading and writing, although those are obviously a huge part of it as well. If some of you are Frere fans, you'll know the phrase reading the word and the world. New literacy studies is really about reading the world. That's what is meant by a context-based construction of literacy, as opposed to a more traditional skills-based construction, which focuses on extracting information from text. Thinking about new literacy studies gives me a framework for understanding why SparkNotes is so popular and what role it plays, because new literacy studies describes the literacy environment in which students are trying to function. Two concepts in particular are helpful here. Literacy acceleration refers to the way that cultural values of speed and efficiency transfer into literacy. With the pace of advancement in digital media, students are constantly called upon to adapt to new platforms with new etiquettes and conventions. This takes time and is at odds with the traditional literacy values that dominate school contexts. These tend to favor close reading and sustained attention regardless of the material being studied. In a way, that's what is meant by literacy accumulation. English language arts students have to learn their way through the whole history of literacy in a way that doesn't tend to happen in other subjects. As literacies accumulate and accelerate, students have to figure out how to manage their limited time and attention in the face of these ever-growing demands. A 2013 qualitative study observed high school students' literacy practices outside of school and found that they engaged in multiple styles of reading and that they made strategic decisions about which ones to use where. This going back and forth between skimming and reading more deeply looked like distraction on the surface, but it was actually an adaptive technique. For example, students might choose to skim a SparkNotes summary if they expect to be assessed based on a quiz rather than something more interpretive or creative, but then they might pause and read more carefully if they come across a detail that's been mentioned in class. The students also tended to see academic reading as a formulaic activity, and they generally believe that questions about literature always have a right and a wrong answer, which is a view that SparkNotes reinforces by presenting itself as an authoritative information source. Personally, I think that students who use SparkNotes are behaving in a way that makes complete sense, given the context and resources available to them. New literacy studies helps me articulate that context with concepts like literacy accumulation and acceleration, and new ways of thinking about attention management. There's one more concept I want to talk about before I finish and open the door to discussion, and that is the idea of the distributed knowledge system. This idea comes from communications, and it's a way of thinking about the new media environment that we're all working in. In a distributed knowledge system, knowledge production, dissemination, and storage happens collectively. People constantly build on each other's ideas to create new information and media products that then go back into the system. To be able to participate, you need to know how to summarize, paraphrase, compile, and attribute the data, all skills that should be able to transfer back to English class.
Sorry, 2 minutes left.
Thank you. If we think about the literacy environment as a distributed knowledge system, it makes less sense for individual students to spend time repeatedly extracting the same details from a classic text when this information is easily available on SparkNotes. Not that study guides are new. Printed guides and summaries have been around for generations, but for this generation, they are unprecedentedly accessible. So here we are. What have I just said? I know I spoke very quickly. Well, the gist is that a lot of people are talking about SparkNotes, just not in academia. Literacy, because of the way it's embedded in culture, is a moving target. And given that context, it seems only natural that students would turn to something like SparkNotes to help chase it down. Thanks. Instead of making a reference slide, I made a doc, and I'm going to copy and paste the address of the doc into the chat in case you want to check out my references. And that'll be my last thing. And then I'm ready for questions and discussion.
Okay, thanks for sharing. And you have 5 minutes to for the Q&A session.
Thank you.
So I have a question.
Hi, Mom.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry.
Just fill in the space. My mom's here. It's pretty cool.
Perfect. So I'll have a question for you, Amanda.
Mhm.
So since there's also I think there's also a possibility that like maybe the readings are sometimes like we're always reading the same books, and sometimes I talk to students who are, you know, we used to be from the same high school, or where their sisters or brothers are going to the same schools, and then I'm always asking them like, oh, what kind of readings you guys are doing now? And it seems that like over the past 10 years nothing changed, and maybe even for like the last 25 years or 30 years all of the readings are the same. So do you also believe that like maybe students use SparkNotes because the readings are just dreadful, and then maybe like we want to save time and we want to like maybe save time for better readings which are more socially let's say more relevant, socially relevant right now, or historically relevant, because a lot of the books that I read, they're always the same. They all have the same kind of themes.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you've just said. Yes, I do think that's part of the reason. There is an existing body of research about reading motivation, and it's generally driven by the idea that reading at all, well, specifically reading novels, is beneficial. Kids who read more do better in school, they have better outcomes. But what's not known is why that relationship exists or what the causality is. It was because I was starting to research that I got interested in SparkNotes, because I asked myself, well, okay, but the kids should be reading at least a couple of novels per year in school. So that should be like a baseline, but there didn't seem to be any information about whether they were actually reading those novels, like whether reading those novels counted as part of their text consumption. So that's how I ended up here. But I do entirely agree, and there are a lot of researchers who agree as well, that encouraging students to read novels that are more contemporary and relevant and interesting for them is a good idea.
Perfect. Thank you so much. You guys can, there's actually 2 minutes left, so I think there's time for one last question, just in case. Oh, there's Sandra who's raising her hand.
Unless somebody else has a question, I can ask a question. Okay. Amanda, that was great. I wonder, you presented new literacy studies and SparkNotes as kind of originating around the same time, that being coincidental in terms of time. But I'm wondering if it is coincidental or if they kind of work together.
So there could be an element of common causation in that access to digital media was becoming more widespread around that time. And that's that like new literacy studies is connected to the idea of the acceleration and accumulation of literacies, where all of these different platforms require different knowledge and different etiquettes to be able to participate. So like that's happening on the one hand. Then just the fact that these platforms exist, that gave SparkNotes its platform. So I'm not sure if I'm communicating this clearly, but I think the same technology that created the environment that is described through new literacy studies also created an environment in which SparkNotes could flourish.
Right, right. And also the ideas of accumulation and acceleration of knowledge, right?
Yeah, yeah. Because I mean, like, well, as you know, Cliff Notes and Coles Notes have been around like literally for generations. But when that information moved online and became rapidly accessible, not just accessible, but searchable in a way that it's not if you have a physical text. That made it much easier to access for every little detail of your homework.
Thank you.
Right. 30 seconds for the Q&A session. Wants to list a quick question, and I see it on the chat box.
Just to let Amanda know that like the time is up, so I'll let Sakina to just prepare and maybe start screen sharing. But definitely, like if we still have time, like you can quickly answer Clerval, that would be cool. That would be great. But I'll invite Sakina to start sharing her.
Okay, so Clerval's question is, though you're at the start of your research, do you have any far-off ideas about policy implications that may arise from your research? For example, how teachers can adapt to these issues if they are of concern, or how study guides can be accounted for and work with educational systems. So this is a really, really big question, and it's hard to know where to start in addressing it. My bigger project has a whole section where I talk about curriculum and the relationship between SparkNotes and curriculum, and how students using SparkNotes either does or does not help them fulfill curricular outcomes. Some teachers are already adapting to these issues. Some teachers are using SparkNotes in their classroom. Some teachers are bringing up SparkNotes in the context of warning students not to use it. Some teachers are bringing it up in the classroom in the context of teaching their students how they can use it effectively, kind of like Wikipedia. Opinions are all over the place and practices are all over the place right now. I ultimately agree that teaching the canon in high school English language arts class is just not a great use of time. So I think that if that changes, SparkNotes role will also change. Thanks everyone who said nice things in the chat.
Perfect. So thank you, Amanda, for your wonderful presentation as well. So now we at 2:25, Sakina will also present in this breakout room. So we'll wait until 2:25 to start. But feel free to hang out here, or you can also go check out the other rooms. So let's wait for 3 minutes. All right, Sakina, you can go ahead.
Perfect, sounds good. So hi everyone, my name is Sakina Rizvi and I'm a first year PhD student in the Educational Studies program at McGill. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today to have the opportunity to talk about really the preliminary and initial stages of my research on accelerated learning and self-efficacy development. So I'll talk a little bit about my background, the literature in my field, the research question that I'm hoping to tackle, the methodology I'm going to apply, my participants, and the implications of my study. So in terms of what led me to doctoral studies, I have a Master's of Arts degree from Middlesex University in the UK and a Master's of Education degree in Curriculum Studies and Teacher Development. And that's really what sparked my interest in doctoral studies in the first place. And then I'm also a high school teacher here in Toronto, and having the opportunity to work with accelerated students, learn about their experiences, the nuances in the ways that they interact with teachers and peers, is really what's pushed me to do more work in this field. So in terms of my epistemological stance, I'm more oriented towards constructivism, which I've just captured here very briefly on the slide. And quickly to read it out, constructivism means that human beings do not find or discover knowledge so much as construct or make it. We invent concepts, models, and schemes to make sense of experience, and we continually test and modify these constructions in the light of new experience. So from this perspective, a constructivist viewpoint, our interpretations and understandings of the world aren't constructed in isolation, but really against the backdrop of shared practices and understandings that we then use to make sense of the world. So before I really dive into my topic, I want to provide an overview of the two terms that I'll be referring to quite a bit in this presentation, just to make sure that everything's clear. So first up is self-efficacy. This was a term that was first coined by American-Canadian psychologist Albert Bandura. And Bandura defined self-efficacy as the beliefs in one's capabilities to organize and execute the courses of action required to manage prospective situations. So I know it might seem like a bit of a mouthful, but one way to understand self-efficacy is that it's the belief or confidence that an individual has to complete a particular task. As for accelerated learning, it's most frequently been conceptualized in reference to time. So the definition here, according to Leon Horsfall, is that accelerated learning involves a course that's delivered in a shorter length of time than normal. So accelerated learning programs would allow students to complete their educational requirements at a faster pace. But this is different from enriched programs, which would allow a student to study subject content in more depth, but it wouldn't change course completion time. So where did accelerated learning come from? This was a concept that was first popularized in the 1970s by Bulgarian scientist and educator Georgy Lozanov. And Lozanov believed that social norms limit the abilities of students due to an imposed understanding of human capacity. And he said that if we can overcome this understanding, then education will reach beyond the limits suggested by the accepted social norm and will be able to tap the infinite potential of the human personality. So this quote really captures Lozanov's vision for the education system and served to really pave the way for a lot of work in the field of accelerated education. So to talk about accelerated learning, I'm going to be using a conceptual framework that was designed by 20 researchers in an article on adolescent well-being. And the researchers defined 5 main domains that impact well-being. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just using the 4 that are the most applicable. So first up is connectedness. Connectedness would refer to the positive social relationships that are critical for emotional well-being. This refers to the meaningful relationships that an individual has, how respected and valued they feel. And there are a variety of studies conducted by researchers like Sydney Moon that highlight how accelerated learners often find it difficult to build these meaningful relationships. And this is something that has a negative impact on their emotional well-being. The second one is safety and a supportive environment, which includes both physical and social conditions. So I know a lot of students who were having severe behavioral issues because they didn't feel challenged enough and they were feeling bored. The cases went so far as that a lot of these students were close to being expelled from the school. And when they were put in an accelerated learning environment, you really couldn't believe that this was the same student or these were the same students who were having so many difficulties before. So experiences like this really showed me how nuanced the topic of accelerated learning is and the importance of providing students with the right learning environment. The third domain, learning and competence. This refers to an individual's motivation and commitment to continual learning, the opportunities they have to take an agentic role in relation to their growth. And there's a great body of work, for example, the Templeton National Report on Acceleration that was released in 2004, that really highlighted the lack of motivation and the helplessness that many of these students feel when they don't feel that they have the agency to take control of their educational pathway. So, the case here that connects all of these domains and forms of well being is that for a lot of students, not having an accelerated learning environment can be really damaging to their well being and mental health in ways that are often overlooked or not considered. The second point here is regarding the criteria that is used to group students and the impact of a rigid age segregation. So oftentimes in schools, we group students based on the age, but as educators, I think it's important to take a step back and really ask, what is the impact of having a rigid age segregation that suggests that age can be directly correlated to intellectual potential for every single student? And another question to ask here is, are there students whose well being is being negatively impacted because of a rigid segregation process? And if that's the case, what is our role as educators to support these students, to address their needs, and provide them with an environment where they can really excel? Now, in terms of the considerations for accelerated learning, the concerns, these can be grouped into three main categories. The first one has to do with the learning pace. So I mentioned earlier that accelerated learning programs allow students to complete their education at a faster pace. But a question to ask here is that, is completing your education at a faster pace really going to be a positive developmental experience? Is the pace conducive to the growth of the student? So concerns over here are really centered around the pace or time frame under which the student is studying. The second consideration, which I think is the most major, has to do with the social skills. So questions we're asking here are, what about the behavioral and social maturity of the student? How are they going to adapt to different environments? How are they going to interact with their peers, develop life skills? These are some key concerns in this area. And lastly, work ethic. So a student may be able to understand content at a faster pace, and they may have the behavioral maturity, but that doesn't mean that an accelerated learning program is the right option, especially if they don't have the work ethic to complete it. And putting that student in such an environment can actually be something that would result in a very negative interaction, something that would be damaging to their growth. So each of these concerns is valid and has to be taken into account, but students also aren't a monolith, which means that while we have to keep these considerations in mind, we also have to be mindful about not imposing our own understandings of their capacity or their ability in case it could be an impediment to their growth. So the research question that's guiding my study is, how do educational experiences impact the self-efficacy development of accelerated students? And over here, I really put educational experiences at the forefront because I want student voices to be highlighted. Oftentimes, literature in this field, talks about accelerated learning through the lens of a teacher or an administrative member. But there's a lack of data where student voices can really lead a researcher for what life is like for these learners, so that we can actually hear it from themselves. These educational experiences are all encompassing: pedagogical, social, emotional, institutional. And I think it's really time that we do give these students a voice to gain better insight about how things are for them. So the participants that I hope to work with, here in Toronto, we have a variety of different schools that offer accelerated programs. So I'm hoping to work with graduates of a secondary school accelerated program. I think that they would be in a good space to provide a holistic overview of their experiences and the moments that have been really formative in their self-efficacy development. I also plan to use narrative inquiry as my methodology, which I've captured here through the words of Michael Connolly and Jean Cladenen, who have done extensive work in the field of narrative inquiry. And I really feel like the methodology would allow me to capture their lived experiences, tackle the complexity in the narratives and stories that they would share, understand the impact of institutional, cultural, and social factors on their experiences. And then really, and what's really most important to me is being able to develop a relational approach with the participants where they can be co-creators of knowledge alongside me. So my hope is that by providing these students with a voice and shining a light on their experiences, researchers and educators can gain better insight about the best way to support the self. Results of my study aren't designed to provide generalized principles. Rather, they're intended to assist educators, administrators, and teachers in developing innovative and inclusive pedagogy that maximizes the development of students who are unable to achieve their full potential in the current education system. Thank you for your time today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sakina, for your wonderful presentation. So we have until 45 to be asking questions. So please go ahead. You guys can either just unmute yourself or also raise hands function to ask Sakina any questions, and Sakina will guide through this question Q&A period.
I'll go ahead because, as everyone knows, I always have a question. Sakina, thank you very much for your presentation. Just amazing, and your slides were really excellent too. I'm sorry, I popped in right when you started your first slide, so if you wouldn't mind repeating a little bit where you're studying and your area of interest, but I was curious as to, so you raised several interesting points about, systemically squeezing people into places. But I was curious about why you were interested in accelerated learning.
For sure. So first, maybe I'll start with your first part of the question about myself.
Yeah.
So I'm studying at McGill University. I'm a first-year PhD student. So still in the preliminary and initial stages of my research. And I think my passion for accelerated students really came from when I saw how much they're misunderstood. So, really it was until I had experience, you always think to yourself, this isn't good for them. What's the point? Please don't do this. It's going to be something that's damaging. And I felt like implicitly I had those assumptions as well. But then when I had the opportunity to work with these students, I feel like this is a segment of the student population that really is the most misunderstood. And there are so many myths and assumptions that are often put in for accelerated students about maybe it's something that's elitist, maybe it's something that is, they don't need it. And so when I was kind of seeing all of these conflicting ideas, I wanted to understand it for myself. And when I saw, for example, I mentioned in my presentation, these students who are close to being expelled, and then you put them in an accelerated learning environment, and it's like, what? This is the same student? And so what happens if that option is not there? Where do these students go? How are these students being limited? And just because they're a minority in the student population, does that mean that we should ignore them, or we should say that their needs aren't valuable enough? So that's kind of, I think, what led me then to focus on this group.
So it sounds like you want to use narrative inquiry to make the experience of the accelerated learning student better understood.
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you for your question.
I was going to see if anyone else jumped in, but they didn't. So I have a question. I came a little bit late. I took a bathroom break and came back. So maybe you already said this. But I'm wondering if you're looking at students, or is there a difference between students who accelerate through a regular program or are fully separated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm actually looking at a multi-age group kind of situation, and we have this program here where, for example, in high school, a student can accelerate by taking extra courses, maybe online, to do it at a faster pace, but that might mean that in the school, a grade 9 student could be in a grade 11 classroom.
Yep.
And so I'm looking at that kind of environment where you do have this interplay of different ages.
So I guess would it be like everybody in the class is in grade 11 except for that one student, or like that student is in a class with other kids who are also going at different paces, who are different ages?
Yeah, so typically I think it's very, very rare for it to be like the one single student.
Okay.
Typically it would be, you would have some grade 11s, you might even have some grade 10s, depending on, where they're at in their acceleration process, a couple of grade 9s, so it would be mixed.
I mean, I can keep asking questions. Oh, somebody's asking in the
Me
chat.
too.
We still have 5 minutes, so you guys can go ahead. We still have quite some time.
There is one in the chat though.
So if Sakina, you could address Katrina's question.
Yes, for sure. Katrina, this is a great question. There are definitely a lot of complications from a policy perspective with implementing accelerated programming or even providing this option in the first place. And I see you said that you're in Nova Scotia. So it definitely, I think, differs probably based on the province. And I think a big thing about complications from a policy perspective can be tied back to attitudes towards this in general. So in areas where, this isn't considered to be an issue, this isn't considered to be a need, there is more resistance to offering this option or to providing the students with that support. So in that case, I can see you mentioned that you're supporting a student right now who's allowed to work in math, but not allowed to gain their credits any faster. So I think that's a great example of a systemic barrier, where you have a system that's saying that you are not allowed to do this because we believe that you are not capable or this is not good for you. And I think that might be the case for some students, but when we kind of take this blanket approach and say that this is the case for everyone, there is a risk of really limiting some for whom, they're totally capable without those concerns that I had mentioned in the presentation about, social or behavioral issues. So definitely.
This is another one that you might have mentioned, but are you excluding students who need support in like socio-emotional development, or will they be included as well?
That's a great question. I think I would probably definitely try to include students who do need socio-emotional development, because I think that's a part of the process. So if they're accelerated, but they still need that, I think I'm hoping that because I'm focusing on their experiences, that's something that can really come to light, to provide that holistic overview of all the challenges they face, and all of their kind of raw experiences and the way that they go through it.
Yeah. I'm picturing like I don't have like an example in my head of what this necessarily looks like at the secondary level, but I'm picturing younger kids that I've worked with who are academically advanced, but like emotionally right at the level. And it clearly would be a disservice to put them with older kids. And they also like, it almost feels like there's no point in advancing the academics until the other stuff catches up. So, but again, like it might not apply to high school as much. Yeah, so I'm just kind of wondering what you're thinking about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a major consideration. I think we can't overlook the social aspect at all. And like you mentioned, in that case, accelerating the academics would really, I think, have a negative effect, right? If you're accelerating the academics and that behavioral or social maturity is not happening at that same time. So I actually think in that case, acceleration is not a good idea. But the group that I was, initially had in mind was the group of students who have completed this program. They've gone through it, they've gone through the whole multi-age process, and understanding these factors of, did you face this? Like, how was it being in this multi-age classroom? Did you have these social issues? Or, a lot of these students are successful now, like they're in the dean's list at their university. So how's that working out? Like how are you managing to still, because people might say, right, that you'll be fine in high school, but wait till you get to university. Then you'll really find out if this was something good. So I'm hoping that, by really giving them the agency and the platform to share their experiences, that these are things that would come to light.
Perfect. So there's 1 minute left. So I think we should stop the Q&A here, but if you guys have any more questions, I think you guys can also contact Sakina. So if you guys have more questions for her, I think that would be great. But thank you so much, Sakina. And I'll invite Quinton. Is that how you pronounce her name? I don't want to make a mistake.
Yeah, Quinton.
Quinton, sorry. I went with like some of my accent here, but I invite you to start sharing your slides or any supporting slides here. So you can go ahead, but we will start at 2:50 for you. So
Perfect. Thank you.
no problem.
Hey, Quinn, how are
Hey,
you?
Vausi. I'm good. How are you?
Not bad. Came to see your presentation. Look forward to it.
Yeah, it should be exciting. I mean, I did a dry run with the first version, and of course, you know, presenting a whole thesis in 20 minutes is like, good luck. So this is the bare bones of it.
Yeah, that's always a good exercise to be able now to experience that way of synthesizing everything and trying to tell the story in 15, 20 minutes. I think it's always a good exercise to decide what is not relevant to the storytelling and so forth.
Yeah, no kidding. I'm just gonna try and share my screen. Can you see that, Vausi?
Yes, it's perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah, I can
Awesome.
see you all.
Awesome, perfect.
Hi, Quinn. How are you?
Good. Hey, Jill, how's it going?
I'm well,
Oh,
thanks.
Jill
How are
is
you?
there, huh?
I'm
Hi,
good.
how are you?
Good to see you.
Long
I have
time
not
no
seen
see.
ages.
I know, it's been a while. So I'm looking forward to your presentation. I might not put my camera on the whole time, but I'm here. So I'm
No
here
worries,
for
Jill. Yeah.
support.
Oh, thanks. So good to hear your accent. So good to see your face.
It's been a while. I know I miss working with you.
Yeah, I know.
Are you in Montreal, Quinn?
No, I'm back in Edmonton right now.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So back at home. I think I'll probably be back in Montreal sometime this summer, depending on COVID cases and everything like that. So I'll probably show up at some point.
Good. Yeah, I saw a different background and you're always changing, so I wasn't quite sure where you were.
Yeah,
Every time I
know.
talk to you, it seems that you were in a different place.
Well, I know, right? And sometimes I'm at my parents' house, sometimes I'm at my house. I'm like in Montreal, who knows where I am? Sometimes I don't even know where I am anymore.
This is not the title we had in the program, right?
What's right, Vausi?
This is not the title that you had in the program, right? In the schedule?
Yeah, I think it is.
It is? Okay.
Is it, did it change?
For some reason, it's easier to process now because yeah. Okay, I was just wondering. It seems like it's easier to process now than it was in the program, but it's possible also because of the way that the words are cut in the slot.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
also,
Just the spacing of it.
So perfect. Quinton, you can start with your presentation.
Perfect, thank you so much. So hello everyone, my name is Quinton Stotz and I'm very excited to talk to you today about my MA project. So the title is Applying Complex Dynamic Systems Theory to Identify Dynamic Properties of Plurilingual Repertoires. And basically, if you're unfamiliar with the term plurilingual, for our purposes, it's a synonym for multilingual. So I'm trying to see if complex dynamic systems theory is an appropriate framework to study how multilingual repertoires exist and change over time. Sorry, seconds here. So what is the issue? So the main issue that this project targets is the linear model, which is the usual model that is used in applied linguistics to denote how someone's repertoire exists. So you're probably all familiar with my first language, second language, third language, and this linear model is often used to operationalize participants in research. For the past 30 years, there's been some really strong critiques against using this linear model in research, particularly because it may be too compartmental. So it's going to pigeonhole those languages into this is my first, second, and third language, even though the boundaries may be blurred. It's going to position language learning as a static endpoint, which says, okay, now that I have that L2 beside my name, my learning is now done. And of course, if you're a language learner, you know that that's certainly not the case. And there's really no benchmark for when you should add that L2 or that L3 to your name. What about if you only know a few words in a language? What if you only know a few sentences? What if you can recognize a language? Does that count as being in your repertoire? The linear model can't capture those types of super diverse realities that research is really strongly indicates do exist. So the goal of my project is in fact to provide evidence for more dynamic conceptions of a multilingual language repertoire. It really strikes at the heart of second language acquisition and really is maybe can be viewed as not going forward, but almost as going backwards, a really big rethink of what is the language repertoire. So if we're going to come up with a new way that multilingual language repertoires can be conceived, how do we do that? Well, we can look at complex dynamic systems theory. And complex dynamic systems theory is also known as chaos theory. It's also known as complexity theory. And its origins are really in physics, but it's been applied to second language acquisition and applied linguistics for the past 2 years by trailblazers like Larson Freeman, for example. And complex dynamic systems theory basically positions languages as being a system that is open, that is interconnected, and that has internal dynamics that affect its evolution. And complex dynamic systems theory has been used in the past to study things like avalanches and schools of fish and flocks of birds and traffic jams. And so it's really interesting that this is now starting to be applied to languages as well. So what I want to find out is, can complex dynamic systems theory, is it really an appropriate framework to study languages? Or is it a nice metaphor? Or is it something that we maybe need to put aside and come up with a different type of conceptualization for language repertoires? So if we're going to really study the applicability of complex dynamic systems theory, how do we do that? Well, my project is going to follow multilinguals as they learn a new language, and we're going to see if the inherent properties of complex dynamic systems theory can be found in their perceptions that these multilinguals have of their language repertoires over time. Okay, so that's a bit of a mouthful, but I'll try and break that down really clearly for you here. So we don't have time to go over all of the inherent dynamics of a the inherent dynamics of complex dynamic systems theory. That could be a talk on its own that would go way over 20 minutes. But these are the dynamics that I'm trying to locate in what my participants are saying how their repertoire is changing. So as an example, imagine if you were to study a flock of birds, for example. And those flock of birds could be made up of hundreds of individual birds, and they're going to change and shift in various ways in the sky. And exactly why they do that and how they do that is so complex that we can't quite make sense of it. But if we take a step back and we look at the dynamics of that flock of birds together and how they change, maybe we can understand a little bit more about how that flock of birds exists and how that flock of birds changes over time. So imagine instead of us studying birds, we're now studying languages and words and all those fun things. So I have two research questions. So the first one is, first of all, do the properties, those inherent properties that were just on the last slide, do they manifest in the perceptions that multilinguals have in their language over time? And if so, what can this tell us about how multilingual repertoires develop over time? Do they have internal dynamics that affect how they function, for example? So in order to do this, we have to approach it from a very specific type of approach, because CTSD says that there are certain methodological considerations which must be considered if you're going to study complex systems. And one of the tenets is that complex systems are so complex that you cannot make predictions. And so I followed that methodology here, and this diagram explains how it works. So the first step that I'm going to do is I'm going to first identify the systems that my participants have. So I'm going to identify all of the languages that they speak, and I'm going to attach those to a name. So I'm going to say this is English, this is Norwegian, this is Russian. And then the second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to find their initial conditions. So that means I need to find in their mind, in their repertoire, exactly how those languages are at this moment before data collection starts. Then afterwards, I am just going to let that system develop. In other words, I'm going to let them learn their languages. I'm going to let them forget their languages. I'm going to let their repertoires just develop according to their own context, their own realities, and their own lives. And at the end of my data collection, I'm going to reassess where their systems are, where all those language systems are. And now I have to try and retrace what happened during that data collection window. So during that data collection window, I'm going to have a series of timed observations that I can then use to work backwards and say, okay, if we look at this red system in the initial condition, it was in this position, but at the end of the data collection window is in this second position. I can now reconstruct that type of trajectory. And so that's basically what the data analysis is doing, is reconstructing trajectories through time-stamped data. So to go over that one more time, basically what you're going to do is you're going to find initial conditions, and I'm going to do that through a questionnaire. I'm then going to interview my participants really thoroughly to find out how their individual context will eventually affect their, and sorry, my neighbors are just doing construction, horrible timing. So I'm going to look at how their context change over time. And then I'm going to have frequently timed observations. So that means that what I'm going to do is I'm going to have bi-weekly interviews, and I'm going to have them assess their proficiency every week. Now, when I get them to assess their proficiency every week, what's important is that I don't get them to assess their proficiency based on an outside benchmark, like grammaticality, because you might not know if you're speaking grammatically, and you might not know, for example, what grammaticality really means. So I had to come up with a way for them to self-assess their proficiency where they looked inwards into their own repertoires and made internal comparisons. So the way that I came up with is to get them to assess automaticity, how easy and smooth it is to just speak their languages. And if you've ever learned a language, you know that sometimes if your languages are kind of weak, you have good days and you have bad days. If you are really strong in a language, your languages are going to be quite stable, and it doesn't really matter what's happening in your life. You're going to be able to just speak those languages. And then once I've got my interviews and once I've got my proficiency self-assessments, I'm going to analyze the data. And I did that through a phenomenological analysis and through descriptive statistics with bandwidth values. So here's a little bit what that looks like. My participants, I have 3 multilinguals that I included. Some of them, for example, Larissa speaks 6 languages, but is actively learning Norwegian. Ramin is actively learning French, and Coralie is actively learning Italian. None of these participants are actually students, but they're all learning languages in different contexts. So what are some of my results? Well, I've got lots of results, so I've chosen just to share Larissa's results with you. So if you look at the initial conditions for Larissa's subsystems are actually shown just at the very end where this graph ends. The rest is kind of a reconstruction, her biography, if you would, of how her languages evolved over time. And I'm going to use the initial conditions, again, just where this graph ends, to kind of say, okay, these are where her languages are right now, and I'm going to pay attention to what's happening with these languages as they change. So with the self-assessment of automaticity, this is Larissa's languages. And through here, I was able to identify the attractor states, how stable each one of her languages is. If you notice her 3 dominant languages, Catalan, Spanish, and English, they're really quite strong. There's not a lot of variability happening in how she's speaking those languages each day. But in her languages like German and Norwegian, there's going to be lots of variations. Her lowest proficiency language, Russian, she speaks it often, but it's very difficult for her to speak. So the attractor state is actually quite stable in there. It's just difficult for her to speak, period. Now, what this tells me is that I'm actually able to look at whether the... Thanks. So what I'm able to look at is whether the variability in their language, the attractor states, impacts the rest of their languages. So in short, was I able to identify CDST's signature dynamics within the perceptions of multilinguals? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. For attractor states, perturbations, phase shifts, co-adaptation, yep, it looks like CTSD is an appropriate model to study language acquisition. Self-organization, more difficult to identify. I think I found it, but I need to think more about that. In terms of emergence, if you're familiar with CTSD and emergence, in fact, no, I did not find any evidence of emergence happening in the development of my multilingual participants. But what did we learn about language, how multilinguals develop their language in general? Well, I was able to identify phase shifts, so turning points in their acquisition in which there are no points of return. So for example, Ramin, first language Farsi, second language English, third language French, he reached a point in French where he started to realize that he can actually use French words while speaking English, and those English words of French origin actually increase the register of his English, and he's able to write more effectively. That's a point of no return for him in terms of his English, even though that beginning point started in a different language. I was able to identify feedback loops. So for example, Larissa, she's learning Norwegian. She lives in Norway. She speaks Norwegian every day at work. Her coworkers mostly spoke to her in English, but over the course of 2 months, they started to switch their language, and that gave Larissa more access to Norwegian, which spurred and increased her learning throughout the rest of the language or the observation period. So I can say that her Norwegian system has now reached a critical point that's creating a feedback loop for itself. And that's one dynamic. Co-adaptation is a little bit more complicated. I don't quite have time to talk about that. But basically in terms of Larissa, that Norwegian that's entering her system was provoking different changes in all of her other systems, but unevenly. So Norwegian basically had, except for kind of one exception, no bearing on her Catalan or Spanish. Didn't really affect her English. It really affected her German, and it didn't affect her Russian at all. But basically what we're saying is that the way that Norwegian system is changing the dynamics of her overall language repertoire is happening unevenly, but it's certainly happening. Coralie, for example, makes an interesting observation that just because you have language interaction, you've got those languages that are mixing in your mind sometimes, that doesn't necessarily mean...
2 minutes left.
Thank you. It doesn't necessarily mean that co-adaptation is happening. You just might have levels where the languages are reverting a level. So Spanish or English is influencing her Spanish, and her Spanish is influencing Italian. But Italian isn't influencing, of course, her French or her English, which is quite interesting. And so just for the last minute, my major finding is that CTSD is largely an appropriate framework for studying plurilingualism, and that this dynamic conception contains way more information than the linear model, and is probably something that can be activated in research to unfind much more examples of dynamic systems, and to get a better picture of language acquisition in general for multilinguals. So I think I only have like a few seconds left. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be welcome to take those. But that's basically the overview of my thesis project.
Amazing. Thank you, Quinton, for your wonderful presentation. So we will open up the discussion and Q&A session. So if you guys have any questions, you can just raise hands or just unmute and ask Quinton any questions you would like to ask.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I know that you didn't have time to talk about the implications, but I'd like to know what you did find as implications. And I have another question with regard to the context. You mentioned at the beginning that they were all learning the language in different contexts. So does the context in which the learner is learning the language have an impact as well on the on what you found?
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that okay?
Yep. They all were learning their languages in different contexts for different reasons. I noticed that particularly in Larissa, who is learning Norwegian, working in a Norwegian environment, living in a Norwegian environment, that Norwegian that's increasing is increasing, unsurprisingly, way faster and causing much wider types of interruptions in her other language systems. Then, for example, Ramin, who's really making lots of progress in French, but his progress is a little bit more slow, and it's impacting his English, not impacting his Farsi, so that context is actually consequential. And in terms of implications, one of the major implications is that teachers need to consider all of the multilingual systems of their students, and that those examples of transfer and mistakes seem to be a normal part of how the multilingual system organizes itself. And without those types of interactions, slip-ups, mix-ups, the multilingual system won't actually end up being perhaps as cohesive. So we need to embrace those not as mistakes, but as a normal part of multilingual language acquisition.
Thank you.
Oh, since nobody's asking questions, I'll ask you one. I was planning not to ask any questions, but thank you for the very, clear presentation. I think you did a fantastic job of summarizing this stuff. I know you have a lot of data to talk about, and I think you did a very good job in summarizing it to us. So I have a question, and this is more like a devil's advocate type of question. So for someone who's not been, what do you have to gain by doing this kind of analysis in comparison with a linear way of approaching the data? So what do we have to gain as researchers and teachers? Oh. Well, I think he disappeared. Probably the construction in his his building. He's probably going to join us soon. Let's just be patient. There he is.
Perfect. Did everybody get kicked off or just me?
Just you.
Oh, not that I didn't want to answer your question, but
I thought you had to get scared.
No. So your question is, what do we have to gain from quote unquote scrapping the?
For those who still a little lost, like, well, what is really the main advantage of using this approach regarding for analyzing multilingual systems, for example?
So there seems to be something consequential that occurs when a bilingual turns into a multilingual. There seems to be elevated levels of language awareness, different types of language use. And the languages of a multilingual impact not just the language that is learned, but all of the language through the system. So when they're operationalized in research, the linear model can erase consequential aspects of multilingualism. It can pretend that it doesn't exist, that it's not there. And there might be something that in the results of such studies, depending obviously on the design of the study, there could be something consequential that is missed. So for example, I remember once in my undergrad I participated in a study. It was basically a pronunciation study but I had just come back from Norway, speaking Norwegian for 3 years, pretty much exclusively. And I was kind of branched into just like L1 English speakers. But I felt that me, compared to the other participants, had a very different reality. And probably what I was doing in that type of an assignment or type of project was giving different results than what the researchers were looking for. So that's an example of maybe why we should develop a more dynamic model so we don't actually miss consequential things.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Quinton, for your presentation. And we will have to move on with Monique, which is our last presenter in for the symposium, well, for the breakout in the breakout rooms. So thank you so much again, Quinton. And Monique, if I see that you're already a co-host, so you can go ahead and start sharing your screen.
Okay, great, thank you.
Perfect. So we will wait until 3:15 to start the presentation. And for now, it's a small break for just until 3:15. All right, Monique, you can go ahead.
Great, thank you. Really happy to be here speaking to you today about my work. So I will be presenting a literature review, and the research has continued, so I'll sort of speak to that right at the end, but to really frame the literature around the co-production of collaboration. And I am an interdisciplinary student and work across the social work, health and management field in the University of British Columbia. And so I am calling in today from BC, from Kamloops, which is the unceded traditional territories of the Secwepemc Nation. So thank you for joining this presentation. So I wanted to begin by highlighting two kind of buildings and locations that were quite significant for me. The first one, for those who have attended St. Ebec's University for the adult education program, you might recognize that space. And on the other side, the Banff Center for Arts and Leadership. And so when I was doing my master's in workplace learning, I started to, at the same time, because I was working at the Banff Center, really become interested in the concept of space and objects. And I just, when I was reflecting back on my own learning, noticed that I was starting to photograph and keep track of various actors that were not just the people in the system, but actually objects as well. So I thought I would share this example with you to kind of kick us off, and then we'll speak a little bit about how this starts to shape collaboration. So with the St. Ebec's program, you do go for 3 weeks on campus and living in kind of a school dorm setting, and we had a shared house with those who were in the program. And so on the far side, to begin with, the table, people would come in, we would kind of sit spaced out far away from each other across the table and have our meals there and prepare food sort of separately. And you're there for 3 weeks. And as the weeks went on, the space began to change. People began to co-produce the space. They moved a table over. We developed a bit of an island that people would gather together and then be able to chat and prepare food together. And all the way kind of to the far right, someone invested in a really fancy tablecloth and some candles and created this sense of ambiance and atmosphere. And it just really spoke to me when I looked back over these images around how these objects and these people are coming together to create something and create an experience ultimately that we have. So my work is really interested in primary care, and part of that is because I work in that space. I work for a nonprofit called the Divisions of Family Practice, and I'm based in the Thompson region, which is Kamloops and a number of rural communities around us. And we support the team there, myself coming from adult education, we support the physicians, the nurse practitioners and midwives to form these collaborative networks, which is the diagram on the side. And together identify problems and how do we work through those challenges. And there's a number of policy papers that are out right now in direction from the ministry in British Columbia to encourage collaboration. And so this idea that everyone works together across the system in primary care and going forward. And I am very passionate about collaboration. And so that's sort of how I started my research, was interesting in how do we learn to collaborate and really deliver on this policy that the ministry has set out for us. So when you kind of start looking at collaboration in the literature, there's some really key themes. So what really strengthens it is strong leadership and also distributed leadership. So a variation between when decisions need to get made, how we make decisions are really key principles. And having a shared vision, it comes up a lot in collaboration, as well as this increased interaction. So I came to my work thinking, okay, I was going to understand how people come together, how we break down silos to really deliver this collaboration. However, once I kind of got into it, I became aware, and I'll speak to how the literature pointed me there around this idea of boundaries. And this is a great quote around how people are constantly parceling up their world and having the world parceled up for them in a series of distinctions between inside and outside, identity and difference. And it really made me start to think, okay, maybe collaboration isn't just the coming together. Maybe we actually have to look at where we develop boundaries in our interactions with people and with objects. So there's a very small piece of my life where I lived in rural British Columbia and had a garden. And one of my friends at the time was an avid gardener, and his main kind of mantra related to gardening was containment. So we think of a garden of really one shared space and working all together. However, it's all about containment. So parceling those pieces off is really what allows something to grow. And if you don't have strong containment, then you're not going to have strong vegetables or fruit or whatever it is you're growing. And so I think it's a really relevant and kind of practical way. So as we look through these next slides, to be thinking about where are the different boundaries. And boundaries can be physical, they can be mental, and they can also be social boundaries that we experience. So from my research, I really took it from a place of three, those kind of middle line, three different disciplines. And from a relational performative ontology, which we will speak a little bit about, and then I went into workplace learning literature and into sociology of science and into knowledge management, looking for collaboration. And what I ended up finding really pointed me through these channels into boundary construction. So we'll just touch on those three areas and highlight a few key examples. So the first one about being this relational performative ontology, I think a simple way to think of it is a stage. And so in this stage, we have many actors that are contributing to the performance. So we have those who are on the stage that are performing, we have the light technician, we have the person and the teams that are making the sets, we then have the sets who are contributing to the experience, we have the audience, and in this case, the audience has actually been brought up on the stage. And so together, all of these actors actually co-produce an experience that is unique. If you went to the performance the next day, it would look very different. Or if this performance was done in a large auditorium, for example, it would look very different. So context and experience and the actors, how they show up and how they interact is really a fundamental approach to my own work. And I have spent a fair bit of time kind of reading and researching around those who do. So for Berard's work, who I do quote a fair bit, it ends up kind of speaking about this intra-action. And this to me really speaks to that. And if you actually take that approach, but translate the stage into the world, your work life, your experience, then you can see how you're co-producing along the way and therefore learning. So when I went into the workplace learning, we're probably all familiar with this. You do see, and this is sort of how I originally approached the concept of workplace learning, is it's one elephant and we're trying to piece together the different parts of this elephant. And as I understand someone else's perspective, I get to know the elephant better. However, some inspiration around Fenwick and Moll's work really challenges this. So when we look at multiplicity, it's not the same elephant. It might not even be the same animal, or we might be speaking about different creatures that we're all touching. And so that, to me, really started to point through a chain around how we're constructing that. So we're not actually constructing the same elephant. We're working across different creatures. Under the sociology of science, Latour is a really great reference there. And under actor network theory, there's a piece around how do we create these ensemblages? How do you bring people together? How do you identify which people and which objects are in these spaces? And around sociology of science, Bourdieu really questions this concept of laboratories and how in order to have laboratories, you need to have boundaries between those who do research, those who market the research, those who understand the research, and together they actually create the science, and it's not just the scientist. And so I think that also speaks a little bit to the boundary construction. And then under knowledge management, really kind of focusing on how we end up learning in our systems. And when we look at coaching and reflection and collaborative teams, we realize we have many actors that are supporting our own journey around knowledge and how we're learning and what we're learning. And so I think that that also ended up kind of arriving towards boundary construction. So through the boundary construction, once I kind of arrived there in my own thinking, I started to go back to the literature and look at, okay, in primary care settings, where does boundary construction exist? And then start to understand the types of learning that is happening there. So I looked at the division of labor, individual, collective learning, and agency. Thank you. So I think the division of labor in primary care is interesting, and this is really one simple example, but when you go into a physician's office and waiting room, maybe not so much during COVID times, but pre-COVID, there's a number of boundaries that are there. There's physical boundaries between you and the person who will bring you to the room. Then there's the boundaries between that individual and the physician. And then when you get into the space, there's also kind of a division there as well of who's responsible for which parts of labor. I also think Fenwick and Engestrom's work is really powerful around this idea that learning, we do learn a lot through objects and through our connections with these objects. And I think the more we can bring objects into our learning environments, we really are able to highlight. The other area that it really shows up is an example from Howard, but around clinical power. And this idea of clinical power really starts to demonstrate how we see boundaries. So one of these articles was speaking to, if you show up to speak to a physician initially, or you show up to speak to a social worker initially, you will fit a different piece of yourself and your conversation into that dynamic, and therefore actually receive different care. And so I think that that's an interesting piece around how we collaborate, is actually how we're creating those boundaries. The research question that I ended up looking at is really, how is the co-production of boundaries enacted during collaborative process? And so I did end up kind of going through a number of research phases, going into the key informants, asking them, looking at the literature, looking at secondary sources, kind of comparing which objects, which people, which collaborative processes that they start to bring into play. I just want to go back quickly to this one slide, because I think that there's some really interesting work around sociomateriality, meaning the role objects play in our connections. And you can do that through actor network theory or boundary objects or boundary spanners, these ideas that, for example, for Scully's work on the signature, traced a signature that moved through an organization and how people interacted as they had to get the signature on a certain document that was required. Or McDougall's work around fluid, the difference between a cardiologist's approach and a nephrologist's approach on how to measure the patient's fluid actually ends up changing our outcome.
Minutes left.
Thank you. So with this work, as I go forward past the literature review now, and I'm deep into the research, and I'm coming back into phase 3 in the next month or so, where I'm going back to those key informants and sharing with them where I saw boundaries enacted during their work and just sort of testing assumptions. There's a number of implications. There's a theoretical implication that something that we challenges our assumptions around collaboration. And in fact, the understanding of how people create these boundaries may actually show us how people can learn to collaborate. And so that's a theoretical implication. At a policy level, what I hope to do is be able to support the direction that's been laid out by the Ministry of Health to move forward into these practical ways. So I just wanted to acknowledge, thank you. I just want to acknowledge my committee, which has been so incredible. They span 2-3 different universities actually out west to support my work. He's one of my big supporters of my work. And I think to just acknowledge, this is my daughter running through the field with her friends here in Kamloops, to acknowledge this is part of a journey, and where we think we might go into the literature looking for one item may actually shift what we end up finding, which is what happened as I shifted my gears from collaboration to co-production. And in fact, that's really enacting that co-production through that journey as well. So thank you very much, and look forward to a bit of a discussion here.
Thank you so much, Monique, for this wonderful presentation. And please go ahead, ask her any question that you would like. So I'll leave the space to Monique and answering questions.
I have a question for the group then. Sure. I'm wondering if in anyone's kind of work, as they think about learning, have they do they see examples of flipping our concept of learning in their own kind of work, that it's not just sort of understanding material, but that we're supporting the production of it as well? I know it shows up in a couple themes.
Actually, I could answer some of those questions, because coming from a dance program where I actually did my major in dance, I feel like collaboration is a lot more present than when I actually like compare it with right now that I'm in educational studies in my graduate program. Even though it's not the same kind of co-production or this kind of like communication that happens, since it's something that's so hands-on, it happens a lot easier, and then the communication becomes a lot more direct, because we are dancing and then we're sharing the space together, and then you know there's a lot of limits that there's a lot of boundaries that we have to be careful with. So that's why we have to be a lot more communicative. But then in something that where we're writing and reading, where it's more abstract, it feels like the collaboration is a little bit harder because it's more like internal. I don't know if that kind of answers some of your questions, or if that's what the kind of question that you're looking for. But definitely, like when it has to do with something that is more hands-on, I feel like it's easier to be collaborating, and it's easier to communicate with your coworkers or classmates. But in another kind of situation, if we're working together on a paper together, it's quite hard sometimes. It becomes a lot more, it's a lot more subtle.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. And I think there's many factors that you've kind of identified that would contribute to it as well. And one of the things that it kind of made me think is in McNaughton's work, they really looked at different roles and responsibilities. And so if you actually can identify clear roles within job descriptions, in this case across interdisciplinary teams, when the group comes together, they're able to connect more. And so I think in your dancing, you probably have really clear roles that you're doing, where maybe that would support some of the student learning working on the paper, is really kind of setting those boundaries around who's doing what to begin with could help going forward. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Monique. So I think the breakout rooms will be closed in like a few seconds now. I think in like 30 seconds. So just thank you guys for being here. I see that some people are here since a few presentations before. So thank you for joining us. And I'll see you guys in the main room. And there's also the keynote speaker at the webinar after. So I invite you guys to join in for that one. But thank you so much.
To the main lobby, and I have some remarks to say. So